Hi, welcome to Valley News Digest. I'm John Gregg, the news editor of the Valley News. We're the daily paper based in West Lebanon, New Hampshire. We've been here since 1952, and we cover most of Windsor and Orange counties in Vermont and Sullivan and Grafton counties in New Hampshire, as well as statewide issues in both states. And you can read us, pick us up at the newsstand, or of course read us on our website as well, vnews.com. We are joined today by two key journalists with important roles at our paper who do a lot there and have a lot of experience as well. Here first is one of our night editors, Vanessa Palange, who also is the editor of our Enterprise Business magazine, which recently focused on the business of death. More on that in a second, but first you might be interested to know that Vanessa was previously the news editor and the managing editor of the Nashua Telegraph and the assignment manager for NH1, the television station there, and she is also the president of the New Hampshire Press Association, a very important group in terms of a free press and helping guarantee the public's right to know in New Hampshire. So Vanessa, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, glad to have you here. As I said, the most recent enterprise focused on the business of death with articles on the funeral industry, taxidermy, I think a palliative care specialist, and a butcher. So kind of a wide assortment. But how'd you come by that topic?
It's a wide range, yes. And it's interesting to know that when you first discuss death, you're thinking of funeral homes. That's kind of the natural place that you go. But we kind of had a brainstorming session where we discussed other aspects with the taxidermy and a few other things. I just took over the Enterprise magazine just a few months ago as I joined the team, and luckily enough for me, there were a bunch of topics that were already kind of listed out, and Maggie and I went through some of the topics, and I decided to go with the business of death because of the way that the industry is evolving, and I thought that it would be a very interesting topic to kind of deal with.
Yeah, and I've found also, people who are in trades or something that might sound at first like, oh, that's kind of unusual, they actually have a lot to say, and it can be an interesting interview. The cover story was by Kelly Birch, who's written a fair amount by us. You edited it. As you said, it showed that the funeral industry is evolving. So I'm not shopping personally right now, but what's a typical funeral cost these days?
Actually, I would say it could be in your benefit to start shopping now. Part of Kelly's article dealt with the fact that if you go ahead and go to either a funeral home or if you know what services you want ahead of time, you can actually pay for those services ahead of time, and you'd be paying what the going rates are right now rather than when your family may be dealing with your funeral. At this point, most of the area funeral homes are saying that it ranges in about the $7,000 to $8,000 for a full funeral service, as well as having a ceremony or a memorial service and burial costs, as well as casket. It's a little bit cheaper for cremation because you're not paying for the casket, closer to $6,000. But there are also issues where that's a lot of money and a lot of people can't afford it. The new funeral home in New Hampshire, they have a separate service through the Cremation Society where they really try to keep the cost down. It's for people who are not having any sort of service, and their going rates start at a little above $1,000 just for a straight cremation.
Yeah, and that's clearly, and cremations are becoming increasingly popular. So how are they adjusting? They're offering sort of this special, what are some of the other, how did some of the other, funeral homes, they still obviously can take these on, right? Yeah.
Yes, and they have certain funeral homes. Part of Kelly's article explained that some of the funeral homes have added ways to take care of the cremation services for other funeral homes. So not all funeral homes handle the cremation themselves. They might send it to another funeral home in order to do that. And a lot of what people are doing now too, that they said, is they're kind of picking and choosing what they want for services and kind of doing a piecemeal. So they might decide to have a funeral service, or they may decide to just do, a lot of times you hear celebration of life, where they do something but they don't actually have a casket or even the urn there. It's something more simple. And the funeral homes are kind of dealing with taking these different pieces and putting them together as people request different things. And it also affects the cost as well, because if you want a full funeral service, it's going to cost a lot more than if you decide that you just want a burial service at the graveside.
Yeah, I was interested, I mean, obviously funeral directors and the people there are there for people in an extremely emotional, painful time for them, but they also have to be real experts in time management, right? What's involved in that mix there?
One of the things that I found interesting is that the funeral homes that Kelly spoke with all seem to kind of waver around the same amount of funerals that they do each year, about 175 to 200. And one of the things that you have to think of is, if there's for some reason an increase in deaths, those funeral homes, they have certain spaces. Unless they go on and increase their business space, or if they have to add workers, they can only handle that amount. And so it's kind of a steady amount each year, as they've said, but they can't really add more. They could subtract, I guess, but you couldn't add more just because they don't have the space. They have the extra overhead costs as well. And that was one of the things that they were discussing, is that they still have to pay for all those expenses that might be going up. Staffing, if there's any sort of increase in wages, as well as space for the funeral homes and parking and those types of items. So those things all still kind of affect the businesses. And they said they really have to have good time management skills in order to be able to get the certain amount of funerals in that they may need to.
Sure, and I think, and you'd have to be sensitive if someone has a funeral in the morning, and I can understand people might not want to leave the funeral home because that's leaving part of their lives behind, but maybe another event is going to be held at 2 o'clock that day there, so they have to juggle that.
That's true. I've been at some funeral homes. I don't know if you've ever had this happen, where they might have 2 different memorial services going on in different rooms at the same time, depending on the size.
Yeah. So they know how to handle that. As I mentioned, Vanessa also is a night editor here at the Valley News. What does that entail? There's a lot of different things flying at you at night, I bet.
There is. If there's breaking news on deadline, I'll give yesterday as an example. Yesterday I was working a kind of midday shift, a 12 to 8. Typically our shifts for the night editors ranges from either 12 to 8 or 3 to 11. Coming at the beginning of your shift, you're looking across the wire services, as well as the previous day's newspapers and other media outlets that may be in the area, and you're taking a look at what's going on for the day and determining what the best stories are of the day, as well as speaking with you, as you've got all the local stories going on in the area. And kind of just figuring out what needs to be in certain positions on the newspaper, what goes on the front page, what goes inside, which stories you may have room for and which stories you don't have room for. So it's a lot of shuffling throughout the day and kind of figuring out what you're able to do and fit inside the newspaper, and also what you think that your readers are going to be most interested in, rather than just making those decisions kind of blindsided. After we have our afternoon meeting around 3:30, and then we start pagination on the physical pages for the newspaper. Usually that's done a little bit ahead of time after the noon meeting, just to kind of get items flowing. Yesterday I started to lay out the front page, but what happened at the 3:30 meeting was everything had to be torn off that front page because there was a shooting in Grafton. And one of our reporters actually happened to be working the night desk yesterday, and she ended up going out and covering the shooting instead, and I helped out with one of the other editors to make sure that we're in good shape.
Yeah, it really is. It's a team effort, and I mean, just to be clear, you guys are editing stories, you're choosing the photos to go to stories, you're writing the headlines, which can be sort of one of the most fun parts of the job, I think, but it's a very challenging part to get the essence of a story. And you're having to lay it all out, so that's a lot to juggle. But when it works, it's a lot of, which it does. I mean, we've had editors who call the newspapers a daily miracle that they come out every day.
It's a lot of fun too, because it's never 2 days are never the same. It's always something different when you're coming in. You know that your day is going to be different than the day before.
Yeah, as we've told viewers before and readers, we have an earlier deadline at the Valley News than we used to, because the paper itself is now being printed down in Pennacook, New Hampshire. So what does that mean about some late breaking meetings or breaking news that happens, say, around 10 o'clock?
Well, those stories, we're still making an effort to get up at least online. We're editing them, pushing them out on our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, and trying to make sure that they are at least out there if they need to be, like you mentioned, late meetings. We've only probably had about a handful of stories that we've had to do that with since we started the earlier deadline. The reporters have been really good with us at working on those late meetings to make sure that we're getting at least something into the paper. And if we're not, like I said, we're putting it up online, making sure it's got prominence on the website, and also making sure that it's on those social media channels.
And we're getting it on the web, and we promise you, nice print readers as well, that you will get it in the paper. It just may be a day later if it's something that happens at 10:30 or 11:30 at night, which before it was a squeeze, but we used to be able to get those in the paper. Vanessa has been at the Valley News for about 3 months. As I mentioned, you were in Nashua, which is a much bigger metropolitan area. Is there anything about the Valley News or about our readership or something that you've noticed that is different from the Telegraph and the southern New Hampshire tier?
Nashua obviously is a much larger city compared to what is up here, but I would say part of the biggest difference that I've noticed is having the college community in Hanover with Dartmouth, and also having the hospital as well as like a really large part of this community. Nashua has 2 major hospitals, but they aren't as significant in the community as I would say that Dartmouth is, because of the research roles and the fact that they have that close connection with the college. And I'm sure you've experienced this in different jobs too, but when you're covering a college town, it's a very different environment compared to areas where there's not a major college that is kind of either a resource for stories or even a way that the town may be drawing on to keep just the town alive. It's the same thing I would say over in Durham with UNH. UNH is a large part of that town, and without UNH, there would be a significant difference in the town. I think the same thing is in Hanover as well.
Yeah, and we've got, I mean, with Dartmouth Hitchcock and Dartmouth College, I mean, those are 2 of the largest employers in the state as well. So that's,
Yes.
There are business-related stories, there's real estate-related stories, all sorts of things that really do sort of coincide with that.
Yes.
So, yeah. Well, Vanessa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John.
And for filling us in on that, and we'll hope to have you back soon to talk about what's next with Enterprise.
Okay, great.
So, thank you. Coming up next, we're going to be joined by Tris Wykes, a sports writer, and speaking of Dartmouth, he covers a lot of Dartmouth games and athletics and teams, and we'll hear from him. Welcome back to Valley News Digest. We're joined now by Tris Wykes, a sports writer who grew up in Hanover and has been at the paper for a decade. Tris, you started here at the Valley News in 2009, but I gather you actually did some reporting for us way back, as far back as 1986. How'd that come about? And you must have still been in high school.
I was a freshman in high school, and I was working for the Dartmouth Sports Information Office that generates news and handles requests for sports media. Back then it was the Boston Globe and the New York Times, as well as the Valley News or other local outlets. And a gentleman named Bruce Wood was working there, and he moved over to the Valley News. And so I had been a sort of a teenage gopher for the Dartmouth Sports Information Office, and he said, hey, why don't you come on over to the paper, answer some phones, take down some scores for us, and you can see if this is for you. And so Donald Mahler, who was the sports editor at that time and was the sports editor when I came back in 2009, he would sort of parcel me out small assignments here or there. Go talk to this coach or go talk to this athlete, and he would sort of help me construct stories in a rudimentary way. And he was very forgiving. He wouldn't tell me, you've made this horrible error. He would just quietly take it out of the story. And so that inspired me to go off to journalism school at the University of Minnesota and then start a career that fortunately led me back here.
Well, covering sports is a lot of fun, especially if you like sports.
Yeah.
And I mean, I did a little bit as a young reporter, learned the hero lead, you know, Joe, writing about New England football sports. Joe Dudek scored three touchdowns and threw for another, you know, kind of thing, in writing those. These days, Tris, your main beat is Dartmouth athletics, and it's been a bit of a mixed bag this spring, I take it.
It has. Dartmouth, you know, has made great strides as a college sports entity, I think. I think it's much more professional, much more modern under athletic director Harry Shee. I think they value and place a real premium on character and leadership among their athletes, and have done great things with that. Not that they, you know, were struggling in it before, but there's a noticeable uptick, I think, in coaches and administrators telling athletes, you represent us at all times, not just when you're on the soccer field or the ice hockey rink. Results-wise, they have struggled. Harry warned when he came in that things might get worse before they get better. I don't know that people anticipated that the struggles would go on as long as they have. He's arrived in 2010. And, you know, if you take the spring, for example, the women's lacrosse team just shared the Ivy League title and is going to be playing for an NCAA tournament berth down in New York City this weekend. But baseball and softball, traditionally very strong teams, have both taken a step back. They're both 7-11 in the Ivy League. Men's lacrosse, unfortunately, has lost 29 consecutive Ivy League games, which on one hand, the Ivy League is maybe the best conference in men's lacrosse in the country. So if you are at the bottom of that conference, you might be a fairly good team in a different conference, but it's very hard climbing the standings in the Ivy League. On the other hand, losing 29 consecutive games against the schools that you're supposed to be matched up against is very difficult for the kids and the coaches and the administrators, the parents, and it's certainly something that Dartmouth would like to turn around sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, they'll have to wait until next season when it starts over again.
Sure. I mean, Dartmouth has had success under Sheehy and Buddy Tevens with football, certainly. They've done very well in recent years, or fairly well.
Yeah, they've done very well. They made a commitment, I think, even before Harry got here in 2010 to upgrade the football facilities. Dartmouth had always been known as a football school based on its success in the 60s and 70s. It had really made a name for itself. And they built Floor and Varsity House, which has a weight room, locker rooms, that sort of stuff, offices. They refurbished Memorial Field. They put in a video scoreboard. They really made a serious commitment to say, hey, we want to be good at football. And that has borne fruit. With some of the other programs, men's basketball, women's ice hockey, some of those teams that were previously in men's basketball, they've struggled continuously, but programs like women's soccer, women's ice hockey, where they've been successful in the past, they've now been down for a while. I think things are a little subpar with Dartmouth athletics for right now in terms of wins and losses. But again, as you and I discussed before going on the air, Dartmouth is the smallest Ivy League school, has about 4,300 undergraduates, I believe. That goes all the way up to Cornell at the other end, which has 15,000. And, you know, it's tucked away in New Hampshire. It doesn't have the name recognition of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. It doesn't have a bustling urban center like Philadelphia, you know, with the University of Pennsylvania, or Brown, Providence. There are some real recruiting challenges, and I think while football has done quite well, other sports, it may not be as easy to convince kids to come up here and play basketball or play, you know, some of the other sports. So that's a built-in challenge that I think is never going to go away. The school isn't going to move or anything like that, but they have to face that every day. If you want to recruit in almost any sport, maybe except skiing, you have to travel more if you're a coach at Dartmouth. You can't just wander out into the Philadelphia, DC, Baltimore metro area as you do at the University of Pennsylvania, and for the cost of a tank of gas, be able to go see half a dozen great recruits on a weekend. You have to make an effort and you have to pay quite a bit more money to get out and do that at Dartmouth.
Yeah. In terms of baseball, the baseball team, the Red Roll Field is a fun place to watch a ball game, and you were saying the softball field also is a
Absolutely.
but man, it can be cold sitting there. Is that a challenge? I mean, it's a short season.
It is, and you know what? Dartmouth has done great things. We should point out, if you point to one athletic program at Dartmouth that has probably done more with less or overcome the biggest challenge, my vote would be for the baseball program. There's no reason on the surface that baseball should be successful at Dartmouth, because they have to play the first half, maybe the first 2/3 of their season in warmer climates, Florida, Texas, California, and then they come back and they get maybe 12, 13 games at home to sort of finish the season. Even though they're back in a more temperate time, boy, yeah, they're in days where the real feel is maybe 22 degrees and people are huddled under blankets and such. So for Bob Whalen, their 30th year head coach, to have consistently had success when his team trains inside the field house for the first month and a half of preseason and then goes on the road to play some of the best teams in the country without ever having been on a baseball field. You open up at Florida State or LSU or the University of Virginia, and your outfielders never taken out a fly ball outside most of the time, and you still do pretty well. That's very impressive, and I think we're very lucky in the Upper Valley to see that level of baseball and to have a gem like Biondi Park at Red Roll Field.
And they've had some players go on to the major leagues.
Plenty of players go on, and they've had. They went to the NCAAs in 2009, 2010. Been very close in many other years. It's really fun to see people do well. As a reporter, it's fun to cover people who are successful, and that program is definitely successful.
Which of the sports have, and there are several, I think, have a distinct following with people in the Upper Valley who might not really have any Dartmouth connection otherwise?
Men's
right?
hockey jumps right out. You will meet. If I'm at the grocery store or I'm just talking to somebody at a wedding reception, I can't tell you the number of times someone has said, "Oh, my husband and I's first date was a Dartmouth hockey game," or "I remember going to Dartmouth hockey games with my dad when we were in kindergarten." Part of that is that it's a very high level of ice hockey. Dartmouth competes at the highest level in the country. It's an interesting, fun sport. And Thompson Arena is incredibly family friendly. You can let your kids run around and you can see where they go the whole time, and you can sit back and watch the game. And so over the years, that has really become the Upper Valley's connection, I think, athletics-wise, to Dartmouth. And you take a look at a game and you'll see people from Vershire or Orange or Grafton, as well as, of course, Lebanon, Hanover, and Hartford.
We've done some stories, this is a little beyond just Dartmouth, but we've done some stories about how elite colleges in New England and northern New England, I think Colby might be one in Maine, are spending tens of millions of dollars on athletic facilities, both for the athletes, but some also for the general student body. What's driving that trend?
Well, I think there's a couple things. It basically comes down to recruiting, both of regular students and of student athletes. It's an arms race to some degree. You get a school like Colby that decides, we're going to put a substantial amount of money into upgrading our athletics facilities. Student health center where kids can go and work out on all sorts of machines and have, an Olympic swimming pool or squash courts. And then they also get, better athletes because of that. And clearly, many universities and colleges want the positive publicity that comes with having successful athletic teams. It's harder to have successful athletic teams if your facilities are somewhat antiquated or behind the other ones. They may be perfectly functional, but they may not have the bells and whistles and that new smell that comes with, a brand new hockey rink. And so if you build that rink and you get better players, and now your team is going deep in the national playoffs and getting some national publicity, and that Colby alum out in Nevada says, "Hey, it's great to see the Mules doing so well. I think my donation check will be $2,000 instead of $1,000 this year." There's clearly a connection there. If a school like Princeton or Dartmouth wants to sell the best chemistry lab in the country. They want to be able to tell people we have the nicest baseball field or we have a really nice golf course. It's the same idea.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you're keeping an eye on those facilities and the teams and the athletic director and coaches that Dartmouth has, and obviously we see through our readers that there is a lot of interest in that. So, Tris, thank you for joining us, and thank you for watching this episode of Valley News Digest. We'll hope you check out our paper every day, and see you next month on the next episode.